Welcome to the Headless Hammerhead Guide to Comic Books. Today we'll be presenting Comic Book Dictionary.
Part 2, The Revenge.
And we'll continue to discuss the lingo of the comic book industry. NCBD is New Comic Book Day. New comic books are released weekly, usually on Wednesdays, although DC now releases on Tuesdays, but most shops put everything out at the same time on Wednesdays, and that's the day that you can find new comic books. And that's also a great day to go into a shop because you'll see a lot of other comic book enthusiasts in comic book shops on that day because of the new releases, and you can meet somebody who can make some recommendations as well. Another great day to stop by a comic book shop is Free Comic Book Day. This is a day of the year where comic shops and distributors have come together and created this one day of every year where comic books are offered to the general public for free. There's usually 40 or more selections that you can pick from, everything from kids comic books to horror to funny books. There's just such a wide selection every year, and a lot of them are great, and it can help you really get into something new. Or if you're new to the hobby, it can help you sample out several different genres to see which one you like the best. You'll be able to identify Free Comic Book Day comics by the label. They are all labeled with the Free Comic Book Day logo, either at the top, at the bottom, or on the back of the comic. Free Comic Book Day is often referred to as FCBD, standing for Free Comic Book Day, not to be confused with NCBD or LCSD, which are New Comic Book Day and Local Comic Shop Day, respectively. Previews World. Previewsworld.com is a website that's run and maintained by Diamond Comics Distributors, and it is a great place to go and find comic books, more modern comic books, but pretty much an entire catalog of recent comic books in the search. You can also find new comic books that are being released this week, and you can also find comic books that are available for pre-order this given week. The website is very easy to navigate. In the menu, you can do a search for a specific title or specific issue, and you can view the catalog, new releases for comic books that are out this week, and you can even create a pull box, and we'll discuss that in a future video. Also from Diamond Comics Distributors is the Comic Shop Locator service, found at comicshoplocator.com, and it is linked to through previewsworld.com. There is a link there to take you to the local comic shop locator. The Comic Shop Locator is a service where physical brick and mortar shops will pay a monthly fee to be featured on the Comic Shop Locator service, and you can either call the phone number or go on the website, and based on your zip code, and it'll find the closest shops to you. LCSD, another one of the confusing acronyms, but LCSD stands for Local Comic Shop Day. It's similar to Free Comic Book Day in that there are specific comic books released for this event. However, these are not free comics. Local Comic Shop Day comics are exclusive comics. They're usually very limited print run and available only at a local shop. And a lot of people flock to get these because after some time, a year or two, they become very desirable. Local Comic Shop Day comics are identified by also a branding of the Local Comic Shop Day logo that appears usually on the front, but it can appear on the back of the comic as well.
It comes in darkness.
You will hear a lot of comic book enthusiasts talk about FOC. FOC stands for Final Order Cutoff, and it's basically the last day to guarantee yourself a copy of a comic book when you pre-order it from a local shop. This is the last day that local shops have to order comic books in quantities enough to get ratio variants, and it is also the day for comic book shops to get their orders in for comics that will have a limited print run to try to guarantee themselves a copy. FOC is every Monday for all comics distributors except DC, because now they want it to be different, and their cutoff is on Sundays. And speaking of print runs, a print run is how many copies of a comic book were actually printed for distribution, how many are out there in the world. Print runs can affect the value of a comic book, because if it is a desirable comic that is high in demand, but it has a low print run, then it's going to be scarce. So there's going to be a higher demand and a higher value placed on that comic. Print runs in the 90s were the highest of any time in comic book history. You had some comics that had 5 million copies printed. So there are a lot of copies out there of some of these 90s comic books. Even if it's a major key, the value is not as high as it could be, because there's just so many out there and they're very, very easy to find. Nowadays, a regular print run is about 20,000 to 30,000 copies, much less than those in the 90s. Although you do have some that have print runs that are up there in the 100,000 or so, such as Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles: The Last Ronin. Nowadays, rather than large initial print runs, publishers will run subsequent printings. So if a publisher expects a comic book to be standard as far as popularity, and they print, say, 20,000 copies, but then the consumers find that it's a very good comic book, or it's interesting, or say it gets optioned, like 8 Billion Genies got optioned by Amazon, so it becomes really high in demand, the publisher will run subsequent printings, a second print, third print, fourth print, fifth print, and it can run as high as, say, 20th print. In the past, you never saw the number of the print on the cover, although it is becoming more common in recent years. Generally, you could identify a second or third print, etc. On the copyright page, on the bottom of the inside of the cover of the book, you would see either right at the beginning of the paragraph after the title, or at the end of the paragraph, what printing number it is. If you are familiar with the book, usually you can tell what printing number it is by the cover itself. Some have a different cover art, some have, say, a sketch version of the original artwork, and some, like The Killing Joke here, have the title in a different color, and that's the only way that you can tell, other than looking inside the book, to see what print number it is. Traditionally, subsequent prints come 1 or 2 months apart, although there are exceptions. There's comic books like this one, Amazing Spider-Man 101, the first appearance of Morbius, where the second print actually came decades after the original print. You also have what are called facsimile editions of comic books, usually of a key comic. Facsimile editions look exactly the same as the original. They have the same advertisements inside. All the artwork is the same. The only difference would be usually the price. See on this one, it's $3.99 where the original was 15 cents. This facsimile also has a barcode where the original did not have a barcode. Now, facsimiles should not be confused with reprints. Reprints are comic books that stand on their own. They're usually a completely different comic than the one that they are reprinting. In this example, you'll see Uncanny X-Men number 93. It's actually a reprinting of Uncanny X-Men number 45. Actually, a lot of the X-Men books numbered in the 80s and 90s are reprints of earlier X-Men books. Some stores and price guides will indicate if a comic book is a reprint of another comic book. This is really the only way to know unless you're really familiar with the book itself. Mark Jeweller's variants. So we've discussed variants in the last video. However, there are other variants that we did not cover. We will do a deeper dive on a future video exclusively on variants and all the details that you need to know about variants. But Mark Jeweller's variants are basically a standard comic book. It looks just like the regular cover A, which is the main cover. And the only difference is inside, in the middle of the book, there is an insert that's stapled in with the original staples of the comic. And this is a paper insert that says Mark Jewelers on it. And it's an advertisement for jewelry from a retailer called Mark Jewelers. Now, these are extremely rare. Generally, they were only available at bases for the military, and the history of that, we'll get into it in the future video, but these are very, very rare, so they're very desirable. A Mark Jewelers variant carries a premium over the standard regular cover A. Now, speculators are always looking for the rarest books because these are less available and higher in demand, so they command more money. So we've already discussed ratio variants, we've discussed newsstand variants, and Mark Jewelers variants, and there's a new one that people are looking for called the Whitman variant. The Whitman variant were actually Marvel comics that were not published by Marvel directly. They were published by a third-party company, and the only way you can identify the difference between a Marvel published variant and the Whitman variant is the price appears in a diamond on the upper left corner. So if you find one of these, grab it up, especially if you find it cheap, snatch it up, because you can probably flip that on the secondary market for a premium. A misprint is a comic that had some type of error during printing, whether it was incorrect barcode, so it could have the barcode of a different comic book or different issue printed instead of the one that corresponds to that issue. Could have a misprint on the title itself, a misspelling on some of the words inside, or like this one, As of the Barb #1, the initial run printed where page 12 and forward did not print the lettering, so it did not have any words starting on page 12. It was a silent comic for the rest of the way, and they had to go back and reprint it. Now this happens frequently, and what retailers are supposed to do is destroy the misprinted comic, because the distributors and the publishers will replace the error versions of these comic books for free, so that the retailers can then have the corrected versions for sale. However, many retailers do not destroy them. So you have some of these floating around and they become desirable and thus usually warrant a higher price. So when a comic book is a misprint or the publisher needs to make some type of correction on a comic book, it's called a recall. The recall basically tells the retailers that they need to either mail back those comic books to the distributor or the publisher or destroy them so that they can then be replaced with the corrected version. Recalls aren't always due to misprints. Sometimes, like with this issue, it's something else. With this issue, Wolverine appears on the inside and makes a comment to Sabretooth that can be considered anti-Semitic. So because of this anti-Semitic word, a lot of people complained, and the publisher said, we need to fix that. So they changed the word to something else and reprinted the issue without it. We'll discuss comics that have been recalled in this way due to racist or inappropriate content in general in a future video. FMV stands for fair market value, and this is the amount of money you can expect to receive on average if you were to sell your comic book on the secondary market. Now this is affected by many factors, from the condition obviously to the variant, to the print run of the comic book itself, to what comic it is, what year it is, the print run on it. But of course, the condition being the main factor. You'll see most price guides will list several FMVs on it, and it'll be listed by the condition. Usually they'll use the point grading scale, although they could use the letter grading scale of an M for near mint and G for good, etc. And you can find these fair market values on price guides like Overstreet, which is the most established and oldest price guide out there. There's also Go Collect and Cover Price, but there are others. Restoration is the act of adding or removing something to a comic book, usually an older comic, to make it more appealing to the eye. So generally it could be anything from removing rusty staples and replacing them with brand new staples, to even putting in a reprinted cover or a cover from a facsimile edition or something like that, to painting the cover with either paint, whiteout, or some type of marker on parts where it's faded, things like that. All of these are considered restoration. It is looked down upon by collectors because it can affect the value. Most collectors want the original unfiltered version of the comic book. Now, There are certain things that can be done that are not considered restoration. These are non-invasive things that are done to the comics. We've discussed some of them, such as cleaning and pressing a comic book. Cleaning is just wiping off loose dirt. Pressing is just removing wrinkles by heat pressing the comic. It's non-invasive and it just takes out easily removable wrinkles or bends or folds. There's also using an eraser on white areas of a comic book to remove marks. Archival is a designation for protective and storing material that is museum quality. Basically, what it means is the material is free from acid, which can wear down a comic book, the quality of the comic book. It also has other features such as breathability. Comic books do release gases that are detrimental to the comic itself, to the paper, and can damage it over time. So a lot of older bags and boards, they were not archival. So if you buy a comic book and it's already bagged and boarded, the first thing you should do as good practice is get a new bag and board and rebag and board that comic book, because you don't know if the material they were using is archival or not, and it could damage your comic book if you just buy it in that bag and board and put it away and forget about it for years and years. Next thing you know, you find out it's turned yellow or it's worn down the pages and it's disintegrated or something like that. Mylar is a very strong and very clear archival quality material that is used to store comic books. Generally, Mylar bags are more expensive than your standard polyethylene or polypropylene bags. We'll discuss all of this in more detail in a future video, but basically Mylar are used on more expensive comic books by a lot of collectors. They're pricier, so they're reserved for the more expensive comic books, and they do protect them very, very well. And they look really good because the Mylar is clear, it's shiny as well, so it looks really crisp. Very good choice for displaying your comic books as well. This one here is from MyLights, which is an E. Gerber brand. Gerber family of companies actually owns Diamond Comics Distributors. So this is a very popular brand because it's sold through the major distribution company of Diamond, and it's also endorsed by Overstreet, which is the oldest and most established price guide. So these are very popular, although there are many other brands of Mylar bags. These do come in different thicknesses, usually measured in mils. So you have 2 mil, which is the thinnest one. It's about as thick as a standard bag and board. Then you have 4 mil, which is a lot thicker, twice as thick. And then the 6 mil, which is the ultimate for your most prized comics, although these are harder to find and very, very expensive. Top loaders. Top loaders are a very, very popular way of protecting more expensive comics. These can be combined with other types of storage materials, such as Mylar bags. So you can have a comic book inside a Mylar bag with a board and placed inside one of these top loaders. These are made of plastic. The edges are hard, except the top, which is where you load the comic. That's why it's called the top loader. The edges are hard, and the rest of it is floppy, but it is thick, so it will protect from scratching, maybe light stabbing, or from something falling on it, but not very much. I have found a much better way to store and protect your comic books, and we'll discuss that in a future video. But for now, if you see somebody selling on eBay or on the secondary market, usually they'll offer it in a top loader if they're a decent seller, because the comic books can get easily damaged during shipping, and a top loader will prevent most damage. But again, I have found a much better way, and we'll talk about that in the future. So where standard backing boards are 24 point, there are other thicknesses available. There's 28 points, 32 points, and then there's what's called the full back, which are a 42 point or 42 mil thick cardboard backer. And these are reserved for very special comic books by most collectors because these are very pricey, just like the 6 mil Mylars. But these are really good because they can protect your comic book. If you drop it, the corner is very unlikely to bend, whereas a standard backer board, you drop the comic and it lands on a corner, it'll still get bent or crunched. A polybag is a really thin, soft bag that many comic books come in, and generally these could have a design on the cover, such as this one, Superman 75, The Death of Superman. It was a black polybag with the bloody Superman logo printed on it. It could be completely clear or can have some wording. Generally, polybags are not made to protect the comic. These are not archival safe. So if you buy a comic book that comes in a polybag, it is highly recommended that you take it out of the polybag. Generally, this does not affect the value of a comic book, taking it out of the polybag. Storing it in the polybag for years and years could be detrimental to the comic, as these polybags can be acidic and they can have gases that they release to corrode or destroy the comic book inside, yellow the pages, etc. Generally, these are only made to hold something that comes with the comic book. For example, X-Force #1 came with these trading cards here, and the polybag held those in place so that when you buy the comic, it already comes with the cards attached. Sometimes the polybag is used to prevent somebody from picking it up off the newsstand and flipping through it, because it has some big reveal inside. So the polybag prevents somebody, a consumer, from picking it up and opening the comic book and spoiling the surprise revelation inside. Sometimes the polybag is used to cover something on the front cover, such as NSFW, or not safe for work content or adult content. Collectors generally describe the type of comic books that they collect, not just by the publishers such as Marvel, DC, or independent publishers, but also by the era of the comic books that they collect. Comic books are identified by the age of comic books that they were released in. Now, comic books have been around since 1837, but nothing was really seriously collected or even paid much attention to in the comic book world until Superman came out in 1938. And that officially began what's now called the golden age of comic books. So Superman was the first superhero, and it came out in Action Comics #1, and the golden age ran basically from 1938 until about 1956. And during this time, you saw the introduction of many popular superhero comic book characters, such as, of course, Superman, Batman, etc. Now, this comic book here started what is known as the Silver Age in 1956. Now, this basically introduced many other superheroes and popularized themed comics such as the EC horror comics and romance comic books. But this was just after the war, so there was a lot of tension, there was a lot of anti-communist, anti-Nazi sentiment, and there were a lot of rules that comic books were pretty much required to follow by the public demand. So the comic book industry created the Comics Code Authority to kind of self-regulate their content. So we'll discuss this in a future video in more detail, but for now, just know that the Silver Age comic books all adhered to some kind of standard as far as nudity, risque outfits, and of course the content, whether it was bloody or just explicit type of content and all of that. The Bronze Age of comic books started unofficially in 1973. There's no one comic book that triggered the Bronze Age. However, this introduced a lot of other popular superheroes that have lasted up until today, and this ran all the way through 1986, 1987. So you do have a lot of major keys in this time period, in this era of comics, but they're not as expensive as, say, the Golden and Silver Age blue chip keys. There are some blue chip keys from the Bronze Age, but most of the Bronze Age keys are relatively affordable, so a lot of collectors seek these out. The Copper Age of comics, also now known as the Modern Age, was unofficially started by Watchmen, although some argue that it was different other issues or titles that started the Modern Age. Now, as far as Modern versus Copper Age, there are a lot of collectors who refer to the Copper Age as a time period that actually ended at one point, and the current state of comics being the modern age. This is a point of contention for a lot of people because comics from, say, 1987, when the modern age, quote unquote, started, to now are very different. For example, the 90s books, a lot of collectors consider the 90s to be its own thing. So I wouldn't be surprised if the quote-unquote 90s becomes its own age of comics. Officially, it had a very specific aesthetic. You had characters with a lot of pockets, big weapons, things like that. The action was huge. The artwork was very different. It's what brought about the modern styles of comic book art, with very fine line drawings, very detailed. And of course you have the massive print runs of comics from this era. When you compare that to comics from today, where the print runs are a fraction of what they were in the 90s, and also you have in the modern times of these the 2020s, we have the independent comic books making a huge splash. They're becoming so popular now that they're having the big two, DC and Marvel, giving them a run for their money. A lot of these are also being turned into TV shows. So in the modern era, the 20s, the 10s and 20s, you have a lot of movies based on comic books, a lot of TV shows based on comic books, from Lock and Key to Invincible, the Marvel shows, and shows like Sweet Tooth. And another big difference is that in the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s, if you collected or read comic books, you were considered a nerd, and that was a bad thing back then. Now, it's cool to be a nerd. It's cool to be into Dungeons and Dragons and all these ancient warriors and type of things, including comic books and other collectibles, and that is viewed as a positive thing. So this era is very different than the early modern era. An optioned comic book is one that has received an offer from a production company to be turned into a TV show or movie. These are not always turned into TV shows or movies. The production company just buys the rights if they so choose to make it into a TV show movie, so that they have the power to do so and nobody else has that right. So lately there have been a lot of TV shows that have been adapted from comic books and movies as well. So it is a great time for comic book writers to receive some extra income from. In addition, it's a great thing for speculators, because as soon as there's an announcement that a comic book has been optioned for TV or movie, then the value of the comic goes up because the demand goes up. A lot of people, before the movie comes out, they want to be able to catch up and read the story so they know what's going on. Speculation is simply purchasing a comic book or any other collectible with the sole purpose of selling it in the secondary market to make a profit. Speculators usually buy a comic book when they expect it to be optioned, or because they expect the character or some event in the comic book to become very popular, thus raising the demand for it and then the value of the comic itself. And speculators use two primary tactics in their spec, and that is the long hold, where they purchase a comic book because they expect it to go up in value over the long term, that's over the course of several years, or the quick flip. And a quick flip is usually purchasing a comic book the day it comes out and hoping that by the next week, because there's a new character announcement within that issue, that the next week it'll double or triple in price, or maybe even more. Or it could be a few days, it could be a few months, but usually not years. A quick flip is usually just days, weeks, or maybe a couple of months. You'll hear a lot of collectors talk about a PC. I'm buying this comic for my PC. PC simply stands for personal collection. These are comics that you don't plan to sell. You plan to give it to your kids as an inheritance, or you just keep them for a long, long time until you desperately need to sell them, or you get sick and tired of collecting comic books or whatever. But the personal collection is not meant for spec. It is generally for your own pleasure. And personal collections can range from just a handful of comics to a whole bunch of long boxes worth of comic books. And that does it for another edition of the Headless Hammerhead Guide to Comic Book Collecting. I hope you enjoyed the video. I hope you got a lot out of it. Again, please go back and watch it over and over again, because I know it is necessary to retain this information for you to review it more than once. You can also see all of the terms that I've discussed in this video down below in the description of the video. And also don't forget to like and subscribe to my channel. Also hit that notification bell so that you're notified whenever I come out with a new video. I try to bring them out every Tuesday, and next video will be part 3, the final part of the comic book dictionary for comic book lingo. So don't miss out on that. Make sure you hit that notification bell for it. Also, please visit my store, DangerousWatersComics.com. It's DangerousWatersComics.com with an S at the end of all 3 of the words, Dangerous Waters Comics.com, and you can find new comics, pre-orders, back issues, supplies, things like Mylar bags and boards and all other sorts of stuff on there. Plus, if it's your first order, you can save 20% with code FIRST, F-I-R-S-T, at checkout. I want to thank you again for watching. I very much appreciate the time you spent with me. And if you have any questions or comments, please leave a comment below. I read every single one, and I try to respond to them as quickly as possible as well. I will see you next week for part 3 of our comic book lingo dictionary. And remember, we don't bite here.